Hey, what's up, everyone? And thank you for dropping into another episode here on the Path to Freedom podcast. Wanted to do a short episode, just me this week, talk about a topic that I get asked a lot about, when I'm having early conversations with people that are, thinking about the prospect of franchise ownership and getting into a franchise. As you probably know, if you've done any research whatsoever on the different types of franchise opportunities that are out there. There's a lot of different, obviously franchises in terms of the types of, industries, types of products or services that are being offered, but it's also quite a few different business models that come with that. And so, one of the topics that I'm frequently asked about is, how much time is going to be required on the part of the franchise owner. I actually had a call the other day with someone who, for whatever reason was under the impression that, with a franchise, he could just kind of put some money in and, it would almost be like a passive investment, like a, real estate fund or something where you're putting your money in, but then, beyond that, it really doesn't require any time. And that's not the case with franchising. So I guess that's the first point I want to, very clearly articulate here that when you invest in a franchise business, you are starting a business and you own that business, right? But it is never going to be entirely passive. Okay. um I'll go into a little more detail as we talk today about what it could look like from a time commitment, because it does not necessarily have to be a full-time commitment for the franchise owner, especially down the road once the business is established and there's a team in place. I mean, it is very, very possible to scale a business to the point where you as the owner are not having to work in the business full time. But from a realistic standpoint, owning a franchise, I mean, owning a business of any sorts, right, is never going to be entirely passive. If you're the owner, the buck stops with you. You may have amazing people on your team. You may have managers. You may have a team of managers in place that are, handling the vast majority of the day-to-day aspects of the business. They may even be handling a lot of the decision making, but at the end of the day, as an owner, it's your responsibility at the end of the day. So I want to make that clear that if you're out there and you're looking for an entirely passive investment, owning a franchise is probably not the best type of investment. Now, all that being said, the reason this is such a commonly asked question or a topic that comes up so often is, you hear a lot in franchising. There's kind of these buzzwords that fly around. One of which that I hear all the time is semi-absentee, right? So a franchise brand may be, kind of positioning themselves as a semi-absentee opportunity. What they mean by that is, they are essentially setting the expectation that the franchise owner does not need to plan to be involved in the business on a full-time basis from the time that they start the business, right? Because a lot of people that are exploring franchise opportunities, they're doing it from a place where, they have a job or a career already. And part of the attraction of getting into a franchise business for many people is, this idea of creating an additional income stream, right? Meaning that they would plan to keep their job while starting a franchise business. You also have a lot of people that, may know that ultimately their end goal is to, work entirely for themselves and to own their own business and to not have to rely on an employer or paycheck. But in order to get to that point, they need the income from the employer coming in while they ramp the business up and get it to a point where, it's generating some consistent income for them. That's, I would say, for most people, probably the scariest prospect of starting a business is, managing that transition and, weathering the ramp up, right? Can I get the business to the point where it's consistently generating income for me and enough income to kind of maintain the lifestyle that they have? So, these are things that naturally come up a lot as questions as people are evaluating, business ownership and whether or not it's something that makes sense for them to, really explore, and putting some thought into, how would someone go about making that transition is necessary, in the early stages of the process that I work through people with. So, we talk a lot about these things. And so what I will say is that, number one, the term semi-absentee, if you spend any time researching franchises, you're going to hear this term. So just understand what the brands are meaning when they say semi-absentee. Is they are meaning that you as the owner do not necessarily have to be involved in the business full time. Okay. So how is that possible in some businesses where it's not in others? Because I'll also tell you, there's many franchises out there that they're going to set the expectation with you if you're, going through their discovery process, that in order for them to approve you to become a franchisee, you need to be prepared to commit full time to the business. And again, that does not necessarily mean that you as the owner have to be full time in the business forever. Again, very possible in almost any business to scale to the point, to build a team out to the point where, you as the owner can kind of step back, maybe spend less time in the business on a weekly basis, focus more of your efforts and activities on the bigger picture, higher level things. So that's possible, but there are many franchises out there that are going to tell you and really essentially require that you're in a position to be full-time in the business in the beginning. Meaning, if you have a job and you're not planning to leave that job, then they're not going to approve you to become a franchisee. But on the flip side of that, there are, and I would say these days, more and more franchises that are positioning themselves as semi-absentee ownership models. First of all, I don't love the term semi-absentee personally, because I don't like the absentee part of that. I think sometimes, people misinterpret that a little bit, and do start to think of a quote unquote semi-absentee franchise opportunity as something that is more of a passive investment, and it's not. And if you approach it that way, chances are you're not going to get anywhere near the type of return on, the money that you're putting in to start a franchise business. You're just not going to get the results that you would hope from the business. So, the franchises that are out there positioning themselves as semi-absentee, and I like to think of it as more of an executive model, right? So how is it possible? So that's the terminology I use, is executive model ownership versus semi-absentee. Regardless of the terminology, why is it possible that some businesses could be started in this manner, whereas others, the franchisor is going to require that you're full-time? Essentially what they're meaning when they say semi-absentee, or when, they say executive model, is they're meaning that you're going to start the business kind of under this manage the manager setup, right? If you as the owner are not there in the business, running it full time, someone has to be, right? So if it's not you, you're hiring someone to do that for you. So it's this kind of manage the manager. So you've got this manager in place that's essentially overseeing the day-to-day activities of the business. They are, likely, at least in some way, responsible for helping to build out the rest of the team. When you look at the landscape of franchise opportunities that are out there, it's kind of all over the board in terms of, how many employees and what types of employees are needed to launch the business. And then, generally the team's going to grow as the business grows. You're going to keep building and adding people to the team. So that can really vary, right? But assuming the business needs more than just one person, that manager to start, the manager is likely going to play a key role in helping to hire, build and train the rest of the team, managing the day-to-day activities of the business. Again, that can look very different depending on the business. So the types of activities that your manager may be handling are going to vary depending on what the business is, what they do, how it's structured. But regardless, it's then that manager's job to kind of report up to you as the franchise owner. And the theory is in this type of ownership approach that your time as the owner is primarily spent interacting with one key person in the business, your manager, and you're primarily focused on making the bigger picture decisions, really kind of acting in that role as a CEO. Good franchisors, one of the ways they add a lot of value to their franchisees is through great tracking and metrics and established KPIs. So if you're new in a franchise just getting started, you're going to have these KPIs that are going to be really good indicators of how your business is tracking compared to the rest of the franchise system, compared to the rest of the franchisees. And so that's where a lot of your time as the owner in one of these kind of executive model setups is primarily going to be spent, interacting with your manager, coaching the manager, making sure they have what they need to make sure that the rest of the business is running smoothly, and then focusing on the big picture, right? Financial side of it, KPIs, and supporting the manager. So that's what these brands are referring to if you hear them say semi-absentee or executive model. Here's the tricky part, right? And here's where I have a little bit of a rub with so many brands positioning themselves as a semi-absentee opportunity, because how much time you as an owner are going to have to put in to the business, especially in the beginning, especially when you're just getting started and trying to get the business really up and running. The amount of time can really, really vary depending on the type of business. It can really, really vary also depending on you as the owner and your competencies and your skill sets, right? Some people are very, very gifted when it comes to acquiring the right type of talent to their team and motivating and delegating. Some people have a lot of experience, and that's going to come more naturally to them if they branch off and start a franchise business, whereas other people either may not have that experience, they may not enjoy, having to hire, train, and manage someone. I'm one of those people. I do not like to have to hire, train, and manage people. Thankfully, my wife's much, much better at it than I am. So that usually falls to her. But there's people out there that are just not experienced or don't have the real interest or desire to build a team and to have to delegate. It's not an easy thing to do, especially when it's your business. Okay, so it's going to vary on a number of things, because a lot of people want to look at this in kind of like a black and white type of scenario where they're like, okay, this is a franchise business, looks kind of interesting to me. They say it can be started semi-absentee. Great. How many hours a week am I going to have to work? And so, that's not going to be a consistent answer for really any, two franchises out there that are kind of set up to be more of this manage the manager type model. It's going to vary, and it's going to vary on a lot of different things. But I think sometimes, franchisors may not do a good enough job of explaining to a candidate that's researching the opportunity, what their time commitment should be, if they're planning to, start with a manager in place from day one. I think a lot of brands are tempted to be like, oh, it'll just be a 5 to 10 hour a week commitment, right? And a lot of people would look at that and be like, well, great. I only work 30 or so hours a week. I've got a lot of flexibility in my schedule, so I can easily squeeze out 5 to 10 hours a week. Well, and that might be the case, right? That might be the case. You may be able typically, to only put in 5 to 10 hours a week. But there's going to be weeks in all likelihood where something happens and more time is going to be required of you as the owner, right? There very likely, will be times in the very early stages of starting the business where it's just not realistic that if you're only putting in 5 to 10 hours a week, that there's that you're going to get the business established on a solid foundation, and just get everything in place that needs to be there. So I think you get the point, right? Is that if a brand's trying to give you these very clear, defined time expectations, right? You can start this as semi-absentee. It's only a 5 hour a week commitment. Really dig into that and try to understand, okay, why is this only going to be a 5 hour a week commitment? What am I, as the owner, spending those 5 hours a week on? What happens if, certain things don't go as planned? Is it possible that I may have to, move some things around, or change my expectations and put in more than 5 hours a week? Okay, so just really, dig in. If the franchisor is telling you that, yes, this franchise can be started with a manager in place, just make sure you've got really clear expectations in terms of what the franchisor is expecting from you. And then we'll talk in a minute about how to, drill even deeper into that and make sure you really understand, what you realistically should be planning for from a time commitment standpoint. But if you're listening to this podcast, then there's a good chance that you're looking to create more freedom in your own life. There's also a good chance that you realize that owning your own business can be a great way to take more control of your livelihood and create more of that freedom that we're all looking for. Also, if you've been listening to the show for a while, you realize that I specialize in franchise ownership. In addition to owning franchise businesses myself, I have a franchise consulting firm, Path to Freedom, where I help people navigate what is typically an overwhelming process of understanding franchising, identifying specific franchise companies that could be a fit, and then conducting the due diligence in a thorough and efficient manner with those franchise brands. My whole purpose here is to leverage my experience working for franchisors, owning franchises myself, and how we've been able to use that to create more freedom in our lives and help you determine if that could be a path that makes sense for you as well. So if any of this sounds interesting, if you've considered business ownership in the past, whether you've explored franchising specifically or not, I'd love to connect with you. I'd love to learn more about you and what it is that you're working towards in your life, and determine if I may be in a position to help. A great starting point is the link below in the show notes, which will take you to a short form to fill out, and you'll receive a free copy of an ebook that I've put together, The 7 Steps to Freedom Through Franchise Ownership. That'll also get us connected, and I'd love to set up an introductory call where I can explain a little bit more about the process that I use to help people determine if franchise ownership could be a great way to start charting their own path to freedom. So click the link below in the show notes, receive the ebook, and let's get connected. I'd love to hear from you. The other thing I want to touch on is the fact that many franchises out there were kind of designed, to be this manage the manager type of business model. Okay. So the point of this is not to say that, it's impossible or it's impractical to start a franchise business with a manager in place from day one, leaving you as the owner with bandwidth to, continue in a corporate job or a career track, or maybe even have other businesses or just other responsibilities that are pulling on your time. It's not impossible. It's not impractical. People do it all the time. There's just a lot of noise out there these days, a lot of brands that are, wanting to position themselves as more of this, kind of part-time opportunity. And my point here is that some franchise models are much better suited for that approach from the very beginning, from that, hire a manager, put them in place. You are managing the manager versus you are full-time in the business, kind of acting in that role of the manager until you get to a certain point where it makes sense to bring someone in, and you as the owner can kind of start phasing out a little bit. So there are many franchises out there that's really how the model was designed, because the franchisor knows that, what they're really looking for in their franchise owners. Number one, they're not looking for people that want to, work in the business for the entire time that they own the business. They're not looking for the types of franchise owners that are going to want to work on the front lines of the business, right? They're looking for sophisticated business people that are thinking big, right? That are going to want to continue to grow and scale their business over time. And they're looking for franchise owners that have the experience and the skill set that, typically people who have been very successful in corporate America are going to have. So they understand, these franchisors who are looking for these types of franchisees, they understand that, their ideal candidate for franchise owners is probably not just sitting around with nothing on their plate trying to figure out what they want to do next. Yes, it happens. People, go through career transitions, and maybe they just decide, hey, I'm ready to break from corporate America and I want to go all in on something for myself. But these types of franchisors understand that they would be missing out on a lot of really, really well qualified franchise owners if they limited themselves to only, bringing in people that were interested and willing to work in the business full time in the beginning. Okay, so some models are designed for, executive model, manage the manager ownership. There's going to be other franchises out there. Well, so let me back up. So these franchises that were kind of designed for that type of approach to ownership, you're going to see that the vast majority, if not all, of the franchisees that they currently have in their system are running that playbook, meaning that's how they started the business, with a manager in place. And that's how they're running the business today. So that can be a really good kind of early indicator, how feasible is it to start this business, hire a manager day one, and ramp it up and have good success without, you as the owner having to step in full time. Are all the other franchisees, or the vast majority of the other franchisees, doing it that way? Did they start it that way? All right, because you're going to see a lot of other franchise systems out there that, I think of them as more of a hybrid, where they've got some franchisees, maybe a handful of franchisees even, that did hire a manager from day one, and were not involved in the business full time. Yet they're going to have other franchisees that were involved in the business full time. Some may have gotten to that point where they've scaled the business a little bit and they've hired a manager, but that was later down the road after they started it. And then, in these types of franchise systems, you're probably going to see, instances where the franchise owner is still very heavily involved in the day-to-day and working, in more of a full-time capacity. So I think of those as hybrids. So really, if you look at, what I always refer to as the ownership profile, within franchising, you've got what I consider, so this is the terminology that I like to use, when I'm talking with people, true executive model ownership. All right. Hire a manager day one, franchisors set up to support that in terms of helping to recruit and train in many instances. Other franchisees, most if not all of them, that's the same playbook they're running. Hired a manager in the very beginning. That manager's been running day to day. Franchise owner not involved full time. All right. Then on the other end of the spectrum, you've got what I always refer to as owner operator models. And, these are the ones where the franchisor is going to require that the owner is involved full time. The exception to this is, there's so many husband and wife team, franchise owners out there. I've worked with a lot of husband and wife teams over the years. It's pretty common. So, a lot of times some franchisors may, be willing to make an exception if, say, the wife is going to continue to work full time, but the husband's going to maybe do something part time just to keep a little bit of money coming in. Husband's going to put 70% of his time into the business. Wife's going to have some flexibility to help out in the background of the business, or vice versa, whatever. I've seen it both ways, many times. But so if there's kind of two people in that ownership role that are both able to contribute time, and they can kind of divide and conquer what the responsibilities of the owner would typically be, then a lot of times franchisors are happy with that. But point is, you've got these owner operator models where the expectation is very clearly set from the franchisor that you as the owner need to be involved full time in the beginning. We're not saying you need to be involved full time forever, but that needs to be, what you're planning for in the beginning. And then you've got these kind of hybrid concepts that are, somewhere in the middle, right? Where again, maybe some franchisees started with a manager in place and others didn't. These are the ones in my experience that you really, really, really need to dig into and understand, if I start this thing with a manager, what is my day-to-day going to need to look like? Okay. And there's a number of other things that you really need to drill into. But number one, you need to first make sure you understand, like, what is the franchisor expecting of you and what's the expectation that they're setting with you? Because I've literally seen some franchisors position their opportunity as semi-absentee and then tell someone, yeah, you don't need to, work full time, but you definitely need to be willing to put 25, maybe a little bit more than that, 25 hours or more in per week. Well, I mean, think about that. If someone's intent is to start a business, hire a manager to run it so they can continue in their corporate career, chances are they don't have 25 hours a week in addition to all the responsibilities they have in their corporate career. All right. Always exceptions to this, right? And like I said, it doesn't always have to be someone that's just, working in corporate America. It could be someone else that has other businesses or owns real estate. So they've got other income streams and some other responsibilities, but they could do 25 hours a week. Great. That could possibly work. My point is, it's all over the board in terms of how many hours an owner may realistically need to plan to invest in their business, even if they hire a manager from day one. All right. And again, really looking at the other franchisees in the system, how they're running their businesses, and how they started their businesses. That's going to be a really good indicator of how doable this is. So I hope this was helpful. I'm going to do a part 2 to this because I want to share some real life experience from, one of the franchises that my wife and I own. This is a brand that we got into 2.5 years ago or so, started it with a manager day one, hired the manager before we opened, took the manager to training with us, right? Came back, ran it for 2 years with a full-time general manager in place. And I want to share some real life experience in terms of, why, from my perspective, some types of franchises are not as ideal to run with a manager, or at least not to start with a manager in place. I want to share some mistakes that we made, because we've made some mistakes, on this one. So I want to share some lessons that we have learned and are quite literally, still in the process of learning. So want to kind of, come back for a second episode on this topic to share some real life experience with you. Also some other, tips and advice from people that I've seen very successfully, build franchise businesses, without ever being involved full-time themselves as an owner. So I don't want the takeaway from this to be that, oh, if I want to, start a franchise, but I'm not in a position to jump in full time, there's no options. There are. You just need to be very strategic about the types of franchises you're looking at. You need to be very, very diligent in your research and make sure that you're coming into it eyes wide open, and that the realistic expectations on the franchisor's side line up with your expectations, and that it's all doable. So more to come on this topic, but I hope this was helpful. I know it's something I get asked about on a daily basis. So and we'll have we've got some really good podcast interviews coming up over the next couple of weeks. So I'll probably drop the follow-up solo episode to this sometime in the next 4 to 5 weeks. We'll mix it up between now and then with some awesome interview podcasts coming up. Got some great new franchise brands that I'm working with. I've got a podcast coming up on real estate investing and working in syndications with multifamily housing, something I'm very, very focused on, something that is truly passive income, unlike investing in a franchise business is. So got some good stuff coming. Thank you all for tuning in, and we'll see you next time. Go drop in.